The morning Margaret Holloway died, it rained so hard that the cemetery workers had to hold umbrellas over the open grave. Her 3 children stood in a row like strangers at a bus stop, close enough to touch, miles apart in every other way. Eleanor, the eldest, stood on the left. She was 52 years old, wore a black coat she'd bought specifically for this occasion, and hadn't cried once. Not because she didn't love her mother. She had loved her mother more than any of them. That was precisely the problem. Daniel stood in the middle. He was 48, broad-shouldered, expensive watch on his wrist, phone barely hidden in his coat pocket where he checked it twice during the pastor's prayer. He had flown in from San Francisco the night before and was already looking up return flights on that phone. And then there was Vivian. Youngest at 44, prettiest by everyone's admission, most charming by her own. She stood on the right side of the grave wearing a veil, an actual veil, as though she were the widow, and wept with the practiced elegance of a woman who had always understood that being seen suffering was almost as useful as being seen. Succeeding. Eleanor watched her sister dab her eyes and thought, "You didn't call her once in the last 8 months. She didn't say it." Eleanor rarely said the things she thought. That had always been her greatest strength and her most catastrophic weakness. Their mother's lawyer was a dry, thin man named Gerald Fitch, who had handled Margaret Holloway's affairs for 30 years. He called them into his office 3 days after the funeral, offered them coffee they all declined, and read the will with the flat efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times and expected drama every single time. He was not disappointed. Margaret Holloway had left her estate to Brownstone in Chicago worth approximately $1.4 million, a savings account with $380,000, a vintage jewelry collection appraised at $60,000, and various smaller assets to be divided as follows: 40% to Daniel, 40% to Vivian, 20% to Eleanor. There was a silence in the room that felt almost physical, like a third wall had materialized between them. Eleanor sat very still. She was an accountant by profession. Numbers were her language. She did the math instantly, automatically, the way a pianist plays a chord without thinking. Daniel and Vivian would each receive approximately $736,000. Eleanor would receive $368,000. She would receive half of what her siblings received. Daniel cleared his throat. "Well," he said, that single quotes as ... double quotes. Vivian started, then stopped, apparently deciding that finishing that sentence would be dangerous. Eleanor looked at Gerald Fitch. "Is there an explanation in the will?" "A letter, perhaps." Gerald Fitch had the decency to look uncomfortable. "There is a note," he said. He slid a sealed envelope across the desk. Eleanor's name was written on the front in her mother's handwriting. Eleanor picked it up. She did not open it in front of them. She opened it in her car, in the parking garage, with the engine off and the rain drumming on the roof. "Eleanor, I know this isn't what you expected. I know you've given more than the others. I've always known that. But Daniel has his children to think about, and Vivian has always struggled. And you've always been fine. You've always been capable. I never had to worry about you. I suppose that's the highest compliment I know how to give. I hope you understand. I hope someday you'll forgive an old woman for taking the strong one for granted. Love." Eleanor read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully, put it in her glove compartment, and sat in the parking garage for 40 minutes. She had moved back to Chicago, -1 years ago when her mother was first diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's. She had restructured her entire career to work remotely. She had been there for every doctor's appointment, every medication change, every fall in the night, every confused 3 a.m. phone call. She had hired and managed the home care nurses. She had handled the finances, the insurance battles, the hospital paperwork. She had visited every single week without fail for 11 years. Daniel had visited for Christmas and, most years, Thanksgiving. Vivian had come for the holidays too, sometimes, and once spent an entire visit talking about a business idea she needed startup funding for. Margaret had given her $40,000 from savings. Eleanor had found out about this only when she was auditing her mother's accounts the year before she died. Eleanor had been fine. She had always been fine. She started the car and drove home. Here is what nobody tells you about being the responsible one in a family. It is a trap built specifically for people too competent to avoid it. And the mechanism is love. Eleanor had been the responsible one since she was 9 years old, when their father walked out and their mother went to pieces for 18 months. Eleanor had packed Daniel's school lunches. Eleanor had braided Vivian's hair. Eleanor had learned which bills were most urgent and which could wait, because their mother would hand her a stack of envelopes and say, "Figure it out. Ellie, you're so good at that." She had been so good at it. She had been so quietly, devastatingly good at all of it. And now she had a letter explaining that her competence was the reason she deserved less. Eleanor was not, by nature, a vengeful person. She believed in fairness, in systems, in doing things the right way. She had never schemed. She had never manipulated. She had never even gossiped with much enthusiasm. But sitting in her car that evening, something shifted in her chest. Not rage, exactly. Something quieter and more durable than rage. Clarity. She thought, "I have been a fool. I have been a fool for 11 years. And the only way to stop being a fool is to stop pretending that being good is its own reward. Because apparently it isn't. Apparently the reward for being good is getting less." And then she thought, what do I actually know? She was an accountant. She knew her mother's finances inside and out. She had managed them for the last 8 years. She started going through her records. It took Eleanor 3 weeks to find everything. She wasn't looking for something specific at first. She was just looking. The way you look when you have a feeling you can't yet name. What she found was a pattern. Over the past 9 years, Margaret Holloway had made a series of transfers to Daniel and Vivian that were not in any accounting Eleanor had been shown or authorized. Small enough individually to not trigger alarm, large enough collectively to matter enormously. $15,000 here. $22,000 there. $8,500, $30,000, on and on. Across 9 years, total, approximately $340. 00.2. Daniel, $195. 00.2. Vivian, $145. 00.2. Eleanor, $0. Eleanor cross-referenced everything. She built a spreadsheet that was, even by her own standards, a masterpiece of obsessive detail. She had dates, amounts, account numbers. And in several cases, she had the corresponding text messages and emails where Daniel or Vivian had made their requests, because her mother had forwarded them to Eleanor with notes like, "Can you handle this?" And Eleanor, like an idiot, had handled them. She had facilitated the transfers. She had processed the wire instructions. She had never once asked what was in them for her, because she was fine. She had always been fine. Eleanor printed the spreadsheet. She put it in a folder. She made 3 copies. Then she called a different lawyer, not Gerald Fitch, who was her mother's lawyer, and therefore she now understood. Not necessarily her ally. Her new lawyer was a woman named Sandra Park. Sharp and direct and unburdened by sentimentality. Eleanor laid everything out in front of her. Sandra Park looked at the spreadsheet for a long time. "This is detailed," she said. "I'm an accountant," Eleanor said, "and you process these transactions yourself." "Yes. Did your mother ever discuss them with you? Explicitly tell you they were gifts to your siblings?" "No. She asked me to handle transfers. I assumed. I don't know what I assumed. I assumed they were bill payments, loans, ordinary family financial management." Sandra looked at her. "You never asked." "I never asked." There was a brief silence that was not unkind. "Okay," Sandra said. "Here's what I see. The will distributes the remaining estate. But these transfers were made during your mother's lifetime from accounts you had management authority over. If they were gifts, they might reasonably be considered advances on inheritance, which should be factored into the final distribution. If they were not disclosed to you as the financial manager, There's an argument for undue influence, particularly given your mother's cognitive decline in later years. She had Parkinson's, Eleanor said. Her cognition was affected in the last 3 years, specifically. I have medical records. I have her doctor's assessments. I manage her medical care. Sandra Park smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had just been dealt a very good hand. Of course you do, she said. Eleanor did not call Daniel or Vivian. She did not warn them. She did not ask for a meeting, did not request a conversation, did not send a carefully worded email suggesting they discuss things. She had spent 52 years being measured and fair and reasonable. She could afford to stop being reasonable for exactly as long as it took. Her lawyer sent a formal letter to Gerald Fitch on a Tuesday morning in October, 4 months after the funeral. The letter requested a full accounting of all inter vivos transfers made from Margaret Holloway's estate during the period of Eleanor's financial management, cited the relevant statutes regarding undue influence and breach of fiduciary duty, and proposed that the distribution of the estate be recalculated to account for the $340,000 in undisclosed gifts already received by Daniel and Vivian Holloway. Gerald Fitch called Eleanor directly, which told her he was rattled. Gerald Fitch did not make direct calls. Eleanor, he said, I think there may have been some miscommunication. There was no miscommunication, Eleanor said pleasantly. There was a lack of communication. My lawyer has the details. You can call her. She hung up. Daniel called her that night at 9 p.m. She let it ring. He called again at 9:15. She let that ring too. He texted, Ellie, we need to talk. She put her phone face down on the coffee table and watched the news. Vivian called the next morning, before 8, which was unusual because Vivian did not typically function before 10. Eleanor, her voice had that particular texture it got when she was performing distress. What is going on? Gerald called Daniel and Daniel called me and apparently you're suing us? I'm not suing anyone, Eleanor said. I'm requesting an accurate accounting of what's already been distributed from Mom's estate, so the remaining assets can be divided fairly. Fairly? Vivian said, and there was something sharp beneath the performance now. Eleanor, Mom made her wishes clear. Mom made her wishes clear about the money that was left, Eleanor said. She did not make clear that she'd already given you and Daniel $340,000 over the preceding 9 years. Or did I miss the memo on that? Silence, Viv, Eleanor said, and her voice was calm the way deep water is calm. I processed those transfers. I have records. I have dates. I have amounts. I have the emails where you asked Mom for money and she forwarded them to me and I handled them. I have her medical records showing her cognitive state in the years when the largest transfers were made. I have everything. More silence. I am not a bad person, Eleanor continued. I am not trying to hurt you, but I am also done being the person who does all the work and receives the smallest portion. So here's what I'm proposing. You and Daniel agree to a recalculation that factors in what you've already received. We settle this without litigation, and we all move on with our lives. Or you fight it, and we go through discovery. And everything, all of it, becomes part of the court record. You wouldn't, Vivian said. Vivian, Eleanor said. I spent 11 years driving to Mom's house at 3 in the morning when she fell. I filed her taxes. I managed her nurses. I argued with her insurance company for 2 months over a $12,000 claim. I did all of that because I loved her and because I was capable and because nobody else was doing it. And I got a letter after she died saying she gave me less because I didn't need as much. She paused. I have absolutely nothing left to lose. The negotiation took 6 weeks. Daniel hired his own lawyer in San Francisco. Vivian hired one in Chicago. There were letters and counter-letters and a conference call during which Daniel said things Eleanor imagined he regretted and Vivian cried, possibly genuinely. For the first time since any of this began, Eleanor sat through all of it with the equanimity of someone who has already processed their grief and is now simply doing mathematics. In the end, they settled. The estate would be redistributed. After accounting for the $195,000 Daniel had already received, his share of the remaining estate was reduced accordingly. After accounting for Vivian's $145,000, the same. Eleanor's 20% baseline was increased to reflect the equitable adjustment, and an additional sum was allocated to her for the 8 years of uncompensated financial management, a modest hourly rate. Nothing extravagant, just what a professional would have charged when Eleanor's lawyer sent her the final numbers. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea and looked at them for a long time. She hadn't done this for the money, exactly. Or not only for the money, she had done it because she needed the world, or at least the small, specific world of her family, to acknowledge, in the only language it seemed to understand, that what she had given had value. That years of showing up, of being reliable, of being the one who handled things, that this was worth something. That she was worth something. The numbers on the page said, yes. You were. She drank her tea. Christmas, the year was the first one they didn't spend together. Daniel sent a gift card. Vivian sent flowers, nice ones, actually, which Eleanor appreciated. Eleanor spent Christmas Day doing something she hadn't done in 11 years. She slept until 9. She made herself a proper breakfast. She walked to the coffee shop on her corner and sat by the window with a novel she'd been meaning to read for 2 years. Nobody called needing anything. Nobody forwarded her an email asking her to handle something. It was, she thought, a strange and unfamiliar sensation. It felt like being a person. In February, Vivian called. Not about the estate. That was done. Signed, closed. Just called in the late afternoon, which was unusual. I've been thinking, Vivian said. Okay, Eleanor said. You were right. About all of it. I think I always knew how much you were doing. And it was easier to just let you do it than to ... double quote. She trailed off. Eleanor waited. I'm sorry, Vivian said. I mean it. Not because of the legal thing. Just ... I'm sorry. Eleanor thought about what to say for a moment. She thought about the letter in her glove compartment, which was still there, which she hadn't thrown away. She thought about 9-year-old Eleanor packing lunches. She thought about her mother's handwriting. You've always been fine. I knew you are, Eleanor said finally. Can we have lunch sometime? Eleanor thought about it. She genuinely thought about it, which was different from the reflexive yes she'd spent 50 years giving. Yes, she said. Not this week. Maybe next month. Next month, Vivian agreed. As though this were a treaty and she understood its terms, Daniel called in March. He did not apologize. Exactly, but he told her about his oldest daughter's soccer tournament and talked for 20 minutes, which was 20 minutes longer than he usually talked. Eleanor listened, asked questions, laughed at the right moments. After she hung up, she sat for a while in the evening quiet of her apartment and tried to identify what she felt. Not healed, exactly. Not fixed. The family was not what it had been. But then it had never really been what she'd imagined it was. She had carried a version of her family in her head for 50 years, a version in which her sacrifice was secretly appreciated, in which being the reliable one meant being the loved one, in which doing the most meant mattering the most. None of that had been true. It had been a story she told herself to make the sacrifice bearable. The truth was messier and stranger. Her mother had loved her and taken her for granted simultaneously. Her siblings had been selfish in the thoughtless way that people are selfish when nobody stops them. And Eleanor had enabled all of it with her silence and her capability and her relentless, exhausting fineness. The revenge, if you could call it that, hadn't given her back the years, hadn't undone the letter, hadn't made her mother stand up at the graveside and say, actually, you gave the most and I should have said so. What it had given her was this: the knowledge that she was not obligated to keep paying for other people's comfort with pieces of herself. She was 52 years old. She was objectively fine, but she was done being fine for everyone else's benefit. That was the difference. In April, she took 2 weeks off work, the first real vacation she'd taken in 6 years, and flew to Portugal. She walked through Lisbon for hours every day. She ate dinner alone at good restaurants, reading her book. ordering dessert without consulting anyone. On her last evening, she sat at a cafe overlooking the Tagus River as the sun went down in shades of orange and pink. And she wrote a postcard to herself, a thing she'd read somewhere that therapists sometimes recommended, and which she'd always found embarrassingly sentimental. She wrote, "You did the right things for the right reasons. You don't owe anyone a quiet life. Come back here someday." She didn't mail it. She put it in her passport wallet behind her driver's license when she landed back in Chicago. She turned her phone on and found 3 texts from Daniel about a family group chat he wanted to start, 1 voice message from Vivian about lunch, and an email from her building about the parking garage. She responded to Vivian's message first. Then she sat in the terminal for a few minutes, watching people rush past with their luggage, all of them going somewhere. Most of them going home. She thought about her mother. She thought about the letter. She thought about the brownstone where she'd grown up, which was now in the process of being sold, the proceeds divided, the whole thing slowly being resolved into numbers on pages. She didn't feel bitter. She was surprised to discover this. She had thought she might feel bitter for a long time, maybe forever. The way certain injuries leave permanent tenderness. But what she actually felt, sitting in O'Hare, with her carry-on between her feet, and the afternoon light coming through the terminal windows, was something closer to neutrality, to having arrived, after a long and circuitous route, at an accurate map of the world. People are complicated. Families are complicated. Love is entirely compatible with failure, with neglect, with getting it wrong year after year. And it was possible she was finding this out slowly, experimentally, to love people clearly, without illusion, without the softening that she'd previously mistaken for kindness. Her mother had loved her. Her mother had also failed her. Both were true. Neither canceled the other. Eleanor picked up her bag and walked toward the exit. Epilogue, 1 year later. The lunch with Vivian happened, then another one. They were not close the way sisters in movies are close, but they were real with each other in a way they'd never quite managed before. Maybe because Eleanor had stopped performing ease and Vivian had stopped performing perfect. Daniel started the group chat. Eleanor muted it but checked it occasionally. He sent a lot of sports scores and pictures of his kids, which she found she didn't mind. The brownstone sold in July. Eleanor used her portion to pay off her apartment, max out her retirement accounts, and buy a very good bicycle, which she rode along the lakefront on weekend mornings with the absolute satisfaction of someone who has stopped waiting for permission to enjoy their own life. She kept the postcard from Lisbon in her passport wallet. She went back the following spring. Some people will only understand your value in the language of consequences. That's not your failure. It's just information. The best revenge is not making them suffer. It's refusing to.